Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast, conversations that connect research with ministry.
Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast. I'm Rick Heemstra. In today's episode, we're talking with Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme about her new book, Religion, Spirituality, and Secularity Among Millennials. Dr. Wilkins-Laflamme is Associate Professor of Sociology and Legal Studies at the University of Waterloo. Her research focuses on religious identity and behavior and how these influence individual social attitudes and actions. If you're a millennial yourself, or you're just trying to understand why so many millennials are taking a pass on church, you won't want to miss this conversation. And don't forget to stick around after when my co-host Lindsay Calloway and I talk about our own impressions and thoughts about Sarah's research.
Congratulations, Sarah, on the publication of your new book. Before we get to some of our discussion of your findings, I was wondering if you could define some terms for us and talk a bit about the religious types that you found. So you've written a book on the religiosity of millennials. And while it may seem obvious to many, can you briefly tell us what a millennial is, how you define it?
Well, thanks so much, Lindsay. It's actually a great question. It's not obvious at all. There's actually a lot of debate about who falls under the millennial label or category, depending on who you look at. The Pew Research Center in the US, for example, has an earlier time frame. About anyone who's born in the 1980s and 1990s is defined by them as millennial. Whereas here in Canada, people like Reginald Beebe, myself, we tend to use a bit of a later time frame. So instead, anyone who's born usually between about the mid-1980s to the mid-2000s. And so where, Gen X stops and millennials start, and then later on where millennials stop and Gen Z start, is actually, there's a little bit of debate, but roughly we're talking about people who are born mostly in the 1980s and 1990s. So who are either young adults now or who are just transitioning into middle adulthood now.
So in your book, you draw on quite a few data sources, but there's a primary data set that you generated and relied on. Can you tell us briefly about that data set?
Yeah, so this was a project that was funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and I ran a survey with the money they provided back in 2019, so pre-pandemic, online with about just over 2,500 millennials, so anyone between the ages of 18 to 35 years old at the time, in both Canada and the US. And I basically asked them a whole bunch of, you ask them as many questions as you can when you get them in a survey, but a lot of questions about, different aspects of their religious, spiritual, or non-religious lives. Your classic religiosity indicators, things like how often do you attend religious services, for example, but also maybe some things that we don't often capture in surveys. So things like, how often do you do religion online? How often do you do kind of spiritual activities online? How do you understand the world? What gives you meaning in life? And so there's a whole battery of questions, and kind of put all that data together and kind of explore it in the book as the main goal of the book, while also complementing it with some other data sources, so other surveys that were run in both Canada and the US, as well as some qualitative interviews we did through focus groups or oral histories on both the west coast of Canada and the US, as well as in the province of Quebec. And so the idea is to kind of get a general sense of, what are millennials actually doing in their lives on the ground when it comes to religion, spirituality, and secularity? Because there's definitely a lot of stereotypes out there, and we can talk about some of them. But, what does it look like from, their own point of view?
That's helpful. Thank you. Now, in your book, you broke these millennials out into 4 religious types, and we're going to talk specifically about some of your findings in a minute. But could you briefly describe these types? You have the religious millennial, the spiritual seeker, the cultural believer, and the non-religious millennial. Could you explain those a bit for us?
So with all this survey data, I used an analysis technique called latent class analysis. Now, it's an advanced stat technique. I won't get into it because I know a lot of people aren't into math and their eyes might glaze over when they're listening to this. But just to give you a general sense, it basically crunches all the data and looks for patterns in how people answered a whole series of survey questions about the religiosity and spirituality. And from that analysis, I kind of got 4 groups that seem to come out of it that you just named. And so the first group, the religious millennial, is, the individuals who are, quite what we typically think of as religious, so are quite involved in activities with a religious group on a pretty frequent basis for the most part, identify with a religious tradition, have beliefs associated with that religious tradition, probably do a bit of digital activity online associated with that religion as well, and so are quite involved with a religious group. And so that group in Canada represents about 24% of millennials, so about a quarter of the millennials I surveyed in Canada, and a bit more in the US, represents about 40% in the US. So over a third of millennials in the US are what we kind of define as religious. And then you had the second category, which I named the spiritual seeker millennial. And so this is a group that are, have some occasional involvement in religious groups for the most part, but also kind of go on their spiritual journeys outside of organized religion as well. So we'll kind of do activities, things like outdoor nature experiences, maybe yoga and meditation, mindfulness activities that they themselves define as spiritual activities, as well as a bit of activities with religious groups as well. So they're not like a complete spiritual but not religious group out completely removed from organized religion. Usually there's a bit of both in their lives, but they're not like regular religious practitioners either. And so that groups represent about a fifth of millennials in both countries, so about 20% in Canada and 22% of millennials in the US. And then I have my third category, calling the cultural believer. And so this is the millennials who, still assign importance to a religious identity. And so will still affiliate with a religion, might hold like a few beliefs tied to that religion. So if they're, if it's a Christian tradition, they'll usually believe in God and in some form of the afterlife. But they don't do a whole lot of behavior tied to that identity or those beliefs. So they're not attending religious services all that frequently. They're not praying all that frequently either. They're not going online a whole lot for the religion, at least not as a part of their regular daily lives. What they do is, this group has also, been looked at before. It's been called like marginal affiliates in previous studies by, for example, Joel Thiessen, or, fuzzy fidelity by David Voas in the UK. And so this group, has an identity, might still practice rites of passage, so might still get married with a religious group, or might still baptize their child if they're Christian, for example, but not nearly on a regular basis. Maybe they'll go on a special holiday to a religious service, but that's about it. So that cultural believer group is larger in Canada amongst millennials. It's about a fifth of millennials in Canada, about 20%. And in the US, it's a bit smaller. It's about 12% of millennials in the US. And then finally, we get to this non-religious category, and these are millennials in my survey. Any of the religious or spiritual questions I asked them, they scored lower or not at all on. So they're really not religious or not spiritual in any way I could measure it in the survey. And so I called them, for lack of a better term, the non-religious millennial. And they represent about a third of millennials in Canada, so about 36%, and a bit less in the US, so about 26% or a quarter of millennials in the US.
Sarah, there's just one other set of definitions that I'd like us to just talk about briefly. You use the words religion and spirituality, and sometimes they're very distinct and sometimes they're sort of blurred. Can you talk to us about what you mean when you use that and why it's so hard to sometimes pull them apart?
Yeah, great question, Rick. Yeah, so these are, some of these kind of, where are these conceptual boundaries that we're working with, right? And so religion, I'm usually using it to refer to any kind of activity, belief, or identity tied to a religious group, or like what we kind of usually see as a religious tradition. I'd identify it as such, right? So that can be a Christian congregation, that can be a Muslim community, that can be a Hindu temple or group. And so anyone who kind of, what we call sometimes the classic religiosity indicators. So things like attending an activity with a religious group, or holding a belief that's usually quite tied to Christianity or to another religion. So that's my view of religion. And then spirituality, can be part of that, right? Like obviously those who are involved with religion also self-define as spiritual. But spirituality can also be seen as separate, and it depends the individual. So sometimes they're mixed, and like with that spiritual seeker category, there is a bit of a mix. They're not completely separate. They're doing a bit of religion and a bit of spirituality, and spirituality in this sense is the kind of in the less conventional ways of having beliefs, practices, and identities still tied to the supernatural and maybe the transcendent, but not necessarily within a religious group or within a traditional religious denomination or congregation, for example. And so some people have a bit of both, and some people do less conventional spirituality is completely removed from organized religion. And so the spiritual seeker is the one who does a bit of both, but there are people in the survey who are those kind of spiritual but not religious group. And depending on how you define them, they can be about between about a fifth and a third of these millennials. And so maybe they're doing a bit of spirituality online, yoga being a very popular spiritual activity there for that group, but there are being many others as well. And they're a group that tends to kind of define a lot of what they do in life as spiritual, their art, their time with family, their time with friends, but aren't really into organized religion or have a whole lot of contact with it. And so conceptually, we can make that distinction between kind of more traditional organized forms of religion and less conventional spiritualities. But in practice, there's a lot of overlap between them. And that's what I see, especially amongst that spiritual seeker category.
Sarah, in your chapter on religious millennials, you talk about the impact of digital religion, and you've mentioned it a few times already. And I'm particularly interested in this because you said you did your survey pre-COVID. Could you tell us about digital religion and how that has changed religion? And I just want to remind our listeners that this has been impactful for religion on millennials even before COVID. So tell us about some of the impacts of digital religion and how that's changed how millennials practice it.
Yeah, well, like most aspects of millennials' lives, they do a bit in person and a bit online, right? So the two worlds are linked, especially, for everyone these days, but also especially amongst younger generations. And so for, work, education, play, right? It's all there's in-person activities tied to it, but there's also online activities tied to it. And it goes for religion as well. So most millennials who are actively involved in a religious group are, participating regularly in person in activities. And again, this was pre-pandemic that I ran the survey, but are also doing stuff online, like posting on social media about some of their experiences or these activities, or looking up different content on religion and spirituality online. That can be, just websites or podcasts or videos, you name it. And some are doing their religious activities in person and online in the sense they're maybe live streaming a religious service, or they're visiting a holy site that they can't physically visit because it's too far away for them, but they're visiting it virtually because those resources are there for them now. And so it's very present. But what I found was that it's mostly those who are involved in person in religion who also do it online. There is a small minority of millennials who only do digital religion, so only do religion online and don't do anything in person tied to it, but it's a very small minority. It's like 5% or less. Most people who are doing online religion, are doing it because it's meaningful to them in their regular lives and their in-person lives as well. And so that's your largest group, and that's where you find most of the digital religious activity is amongst that kind of already religious millennial category that's actively religious in person. But it does have some interesting impacts on religion, right? Religion isn't immune to the digital world. It is being shaped and is changing with it. Because in the digital world, the individual has a lot more kind of choice or power or is agency when it comes to what they consume, when they consume it, what they're looking for. And so millennials are almost expecting that now in their in-person activities as well, right? It shifts a bit the boundaries of where authority lies. Now, don't get me wrong. In the digital world, there's people who have authority, kind of external, either religious leaders or gatekeepers, right? People who are creating the content, who are paying for the content, maybe are inserting paywalls that you have to pay for the content. And so there's definitely power relationships there and authority relationships there that are external to the individual. But the individual user also has a lot more agency in terms if they're bored by something, they can just click to the next website or stop listening very easily. Whereas in person, you tend to you're being fed maybe a lecture or maybe you're doing an in-group activity and it looks a lot different than what you do online. And so, and online, there's also just the practical reality of you have access to a whole lot more, right? Globally, it's got a much more international focus to it often. And so these are elements that, millennials are experiencing in digital religion. And some of them are maybe bringing that into their in-person experiences as well, right? Maybe they're expecting a bit more interactive content, if you will, during their in-person activities. And so that's something to look at moving forward. It's not just the real world that's impacting what's put online. The online world is kind of shaping new behaviors when it comes to religious content and religious activity that might be impacting, in turn, the analog world or the in-person world.
Sarah, in your book, you talk about the subjective turn in religion. So people would more look to connect with their authentic self than, say, to connect with God. And this has been written about a fair bit. You have this one sentence that's really dense, and I'd like you to help us unpack this a little bit. And you write, faced with advanced modernity's alienating dynamics of neoliberal capitalism and extreme individualism, individuals turn to new forms of spirituality which sacralize the self and provide new sources of comfort, wellness, and meaning in the modern age. So help us to understand this, because I'm really intrigued. What is particularly alienating about neoliberalism? And you might have to talk about what neoliberalism is. And what's the mechanism where that alienation leads us to self-sacralize or to make ourselves holy?
Yeah, it's a great question, Rick. It's one that we could spend all day talking about, right? So I'll try and do my best in the next few minutes to unpack it a bit more. Listen, one way to start is that we're not in the same society as we were pre-1960s, maybe, if that's, we can use that as a turning point in Canada and in a lot of Western societies. Since the 1960s, there's really been this turn towards very strong values of individualism. Now, there's obviously that their history and build up to that goes back further than the 1960s, but it's really kind of with the boomer generation at that moment that we see this shift towards maybe different societal values than we had before. And so when I talk about values of individualism, these are ones that actually come up quite a bit when you're talking to millennials. Things like they value choice, right? They value their own decision making. They value kind of what they call these authentic experiences that kind of get them, that exclude, kind of get rid of any external source of authority, like, from parents or from religious leaders or from political leaders or from God. And they really kind of go back to what is important to them fundamentally. And that's how they're defining it, right? I'm a sociologist, so I also see the social influences behind that, but we'll get to that in a moment. That's something when you're talking to millennials and you ask them what's important to them, this kind of freedom that comes with that choice, this kind of themselves as the key decision makers and arbiters in their lives, those are key values that, most of us now hold, but especially amongst younger generations who've really been raised in this post-1960s context. Now, those values, to take a step back, go hand in hand with consumer market society, right? Your consumer market society, capitalism now, wants you to buy stuff. And so wants to focus on the individual. You got to aim for happiness, and how do you get happy? You buy stuff, right? And so it's hard to kind of see this shift since the 1960s towards these more values that are focused on the individual as distinct from the consumer market society that really ramps up during that same period, because they are in fact quite intertwined. They're reinforced. You think of any kind of ad campaign, they're usually focused on the individual, and they're usually focused on these, notions of personal happiness, of authentic experience, of, your own choice and how great this choice is, and you should totally buy this product, right? That's the context that we live in. And there's, some people always see that as a bad thing, but there's good and bad in the sense that maybe before the 1960s, some of the community constraints that certain individuals experienced were also extremely unpleasant. If you deviated from the norm in a society where there were stronger social norms tied to stronger communities of the past, if you deviated from that, your experiences were not great, right? So if you were, for example, a member of the LGBTQ plus community, or if you were a woman who didn't want to have kids, pre-1960s, and even to a certain extent today, but really before pre-1960s, it was very difficult. And so, there is amount of freedom that comes with the new kind of values that we have now. And so, I don't want to just make it sound like it's a bad thing, but there are some downsides too, right? And one of them being is that in some ways, the classic alienation concept is that you don't make things yourself. You're not really in direct contact with the fundamental things that you make or that you experience in your lives. You're always a few degrees removed. There's many people creating them in society, and you're kind of removed with from using a digital barrier. You're removed from them using that, or you're removed from them in the sense that your work is not directly creating something. It's actually something that's 4 or 5 degrees. You're creating a small component and you never see the final product. That's kind of like the classic Marxist view of alienation. But today, what we're seeing is that people are less involved on average in communities. In the classic term that we've involved, millennials are involved much more in digital communities than previous generations. But that's a different type of community. It's not necessarily the same kind of regular in-person contact that people have. And so there's this type of alienation that happens from communities, maybe from family as well, as this focus on the individual becomes this hyper focus happens. And so, individuals are kind of everything in their lives starts kind of following this hyper focus towards their own selves. And this is where this kind of shift of they're maybe not so much into an external authority of God anymore. They're kind of focused more on, what's important to them, seeing themselves as the kind of center of their lives, and in a way sacralizing themselves, aiming for health and wellness and happiness as their key aims in life, rather than say, trying to be good in a whole community to aim for a better afterlife, right? So this is kind of like a shift that seems to be happening. Now, obviously, this is a general trend. It's not everyone who's experiencing this, and there's different ways of experiencing this, but you do see it amongst millennials a lot more. The religion they're looking for is often based on their own kind of a religion that will enhance their own personal experiences, their own experiences of revelation, of connection with a higher power, or, amongst Christians with Jesus, for example. And so that's really their key, kind of what they're seeking out and what they're often looking for. And for those who are removed from religion, maybe who are spiritual but not religious, they're often looking for this kind of spiritual connection that kind of enhances their own experiences and their own authentic self, right? And even the non-religious millennial will do that, but maybe outside of religion and spirituality will look for other activities, other types of meaning that aren't necessarily tied to the supernatural or to the transcendent, that kind of, again, enhance their own experiences of meaning and their own personal lives. And so the individual becomes that hyper focus. And so it's really fascinating to see that in a lot of different facets, and it affects all millennials and everyone in society, but millennials especially that grew up in this kind of context where this was more the focus. And yeah, so there's some, again, I could talk about this all day, but that's kind of generally what I was aiming for when I was talking about this sense of, you're getting, the focus is now more on the individual, and everything, including religion, it has that focus too.
Just to follow up on one of your things you said, you're talking about the interrelationship between consumerism and this kind of subjective individualism. I'm wondering, could you say that we're building our authentic self through our choices and our purchases? Yeah,
for sure. Like that just the idea of an authentic self has been generated by our consumer market economy, right? Like what you are now is not good enough. You need to change things. You need to buy other things. You need to spend your money to be able to get better, right? To get more authentic, to get healthier, to get prettier, to get, whatever. It's hard to disentangle the two. I don't want to just reduce that to just consumer market economy, because in the end it does go beyond that, but it came about with it, and it's hard to disentangle them, because it's, our values that we have as a society are usually linked to our material and practical and environmental conditions, and this is kind of that link that we're seeing. Yeah.
Sarah,
that's fascinating.
It is so fascinating. And so I think what struck me is that, millennials didn't emerge in a vacuum. We've been influenced, we've been shaped by a lot of the choices made, prior to us even being born. And so you wrote you said the choice-based approach favored by non-religious parents often ends up leading to a more secular upbringing. And so without this sort of socialization in religious and spiritual matters, it's rare that children spontaneously pick up an interest, is what you say, on their own in religion. So if parents wanted to pass their faith on to their children, how should they handle the question of choice, do you think?
Oh, that's a big question, Lindsay. Yeah, no, and great question. Okay, let's start from the start. Yeah, so each generation, and I was taking in the book, I rely on Karl Mannheim's theory. He's a classic sociologist of generations and of social change, and he talks about the distinct social location of each generation, right? So when a generation is born, it's born into a certain social environment. And that environment has, it impacts everyone in society, regardless of your age, but it really has a big impact on those who are being raised and who are going through their childhood and teenage years in that environment. So there's kind of, in the book, I won't get into it in detail here, but there's kind of these different elements of the social location of millennials. They're quite distinct compared, that really impacted them more so than previous generations. So things like the digital age, the fact that millennials grew up in a time when, digital tech was created and became prevalent. And another aspect of that social location is the more what I call the secular social environment, in the sense that, I'm not saying religion's completely disappeared, but it is probably much less prevalent in most social environments for millennials when they were growing up and when they're living their current lives than it was in the past, right? You think of, say, like the 19th century or the early 20th century for, pre-boomer generation, so the silent generation, the greatest generation, and even compared to boomers. So, for example, amongst the boomer generation, those born between the 1940s and 1960s, a lot of them attended religious services with their parents, even though if later on they decide to move away from organized religion in their adult lives, they still had that kind of upbringing that still kind of, they still see spiritual matters as important in their lives, even if they're not pursuing them with an organized religious group. Whereas millennials and the Gen X and millennials and Gen Z that's coming after, they're not as in that environment where it's as prevalent, right? A lot of them didn't attend religious services or didn't have regular contact with a religious group. And, like anything, including, what products we buy, what values we have, what behaviors we do in our regular everyday lives, it goes for religion that, if you're not in an environment where it's seen as important and you've been raised to think it's important and you have key people in your lives, your key social relationships that show that it's important, it's pretty rare to pick it up just on your own. It can happen. Like, people have agency. They can make their own decisions. And sometimes some people go for something that they've had no exposure to before, but are just interested by it. But that's more the exception than the rule. The trend is that millennials tend to kind of follow what their parents were doing. And so if their parents kind of showed that religion was important as millennials were growing up, those millennials are much more likely to become the religious millennials as adults. Not all of them do, but many of them do, compared to, say, a millennial who's raised by non-religious parents who, the non-religious parents might not have been anti-religion. They might just kind of been indifferent towards it. Be like, oh, okay, if you're into religion, you do you, child, but we're not going to really, we don't have the resources or know-how or will to really expose you to it as a child. And so, you do you, it's a choice base, right? We're not going to be against you if you decide to get into religion. But that approach, that kind of choice-based approach to raising your kids, actually, for the most part, raises non-religious kids because they're like, oh, okay, it's kind of seen as religion and spirituality are seen as optional in a sense. And if no one around me is doing it, why would I do? Why would I pick it up kind of spontaneously? I'll pick up other things that, other ways of living and thinking and believing that are outside of organized religion or outside of kind of less conventional forms of spirituality. And so, again, a trend, not everyone, but it's a trend that we definitely see very strongly amongst all generations, including millennials. You're very impacted by how you were raised and those kind of key values and behaviors you picked up during your child and teenage years. So that's what we're seeing. And so this is why if both your parents are non-religious, 90% of millennials who have two non-religious parents are non-religious themselves as adults, right? That's huge. That's like a super strong rate of transmission. Like 90% is the highest. Like that's better than Catholics. That's better than, evangelical Protestants. That rate of transmission is definitely by far the strongest in our society. And so in the book, I'm using this non-religious category kind of as the default category, in a sense, amongst the millennial generation. That's how I see it. There definitely is religion and spirituality amongst millennials, right? Some people have the stereotypes that millennials are all non-religious and completely removed from spirituality. A lot of them actually are involved in religion and spirituality, but those who are grappling with this kind of default category of non-religion, right? Like the religious millennials seems to have to defend why they're religious in a lot of contexts, right? To their friends, in contexts where religion isn't as much the norm as it used to be. The same with kind of your spiritual millennials, kind of have to self-justify and defend. It makes religious and spiritual millennials much more aware of why they're religious and spiritual than, say, in prior generations where it was just what you did and maybe you didn't think about it as much. Millennials are very good at articulating what's important to them and why they stay in contact and active with a religious group, for example, for those who are. But the kind of default seems to be if they're not raised in a more religious upbringing or context or with religious socialization, they seem to default onto non-religion a lot more. Let's compare them to a previous birth cohort. So say people in the 1920s and 1930s. Those who were raised in the 1920s or born in the 1920s and 30s, even if they had non-religious parents, they were much more likely to be religious as adults because maybe they married a partner who was more religious, or they had other social contacts around them, other family members, members of the community who were more actively involved in a religion and kind of brought them into it. And so the rate of transmission of non-religion in the past was quite low. So it was, even if you were born, if you're raised non-religious, you became religious through other contacts. Now, because the environment has changed, religion is less prevalent in everyday lives. It's very easy to live a life without any contact with a religious group. You see that many millennials do. That chance that you're going to pick it up if you're not raised with it is much lower now. And there's a much higher rate of transmission of non-religion that's kind of, people are non-religious and can live that life without having to think about it and think about that non-religion. So that's the background. There's one last, sorry, before you jump in, There's one last element of that question, which is the big one. So what do religious people do, right? If they want to raise their kids, they want their kids to keep their faith. And that's the big question that a lot of religious millennials have to grapple with, because a lot of them now are in their middle adulthood years. So are, in their coming into their 30s and 40s. Lots are having kids. And so if you're a religious millennial who sees faith as important and really wants to pass that faith on to their kids, how do you do that in an environment where it's basically all on you, right? The kid's not going to pick it up at school. The kid's not going to pick religion up necessarily in their wider community, depending where you are, but for the most part. So how do you pass that religion on? And it is, obviously the religious group has a role to play in supporting parents, and they really do. That is like a key role. Religious groups, if they want, the key gains that religious groups have of keeping people in their doors really comes mainly from religious transmission, right? There isn't a whole lot of conversion in Canada. It happens, but it's not the key trend. The key trend, most people who are religious in Canada, amongst millennials and other generations, were raised that way and stay with the religion that they're raised in for the most part. And so if I'd say religious groups really focus on that, many already do, but that focus on that key kind of when their members are having kids, that's a key time to get involved, right? To provide supports, to provide activities, to provide education in a certain sense, as much as the parent is willing to be involved in that. But a lot of it falls on the millennial parent because maybe the religious group helps a lot, but it's a lot on them to kind of impart these key beliefs to their children, to kind of impart the importance, these key rituals and practices. Whereas in the past, maybe the kid would pick it up in a lot of different places. Now they pick it up mainly only from their parents. And this is where there's a real issue in grappling, because the parents don't want to force this onto their kids either, right? Because again, we have these key values of individual choice, and they really want their kids to be independent-minded and to make their own decisions and raise them that way. But they also want them to keep their faith because they see how important it is. And so they're grappling between this kind of really wanting to impart this faith and having to really push it because they're the only people who can, and still keeping those values of independent thought and choice for their kids to be able to choose what they actually want to do in an environment where religion is a lot less prevalent.
Sarah, I find this so fascinating. If I'm hearing you right, you're sort of suggesting that context makes belief plausible.
Oh, yeah.
And that to a large extent, although we have this idea that we individually sort of create our beliefs, in many ways they're either socially held or at least made possible or plausible by the context that we're in. At the end of your book, when you're doing your conclusions, you had this really interesting, I don't know whether there's an observation or a hypothesis that while we have sort of this expressive individualism, that were something to happen like an environmental catastrophe that made sort of the resources to create these individual identities difficult, that we would have to move to a different kind of religious understanding. Can you talk about that? Because I think that sometimes we feel that the orthodoxy, the cultural orthodoxy, is unassailable, and yet you're suggesting that a change like an environmental catastrophe could undo that orthodoxy.
Yeah, great question, Rick. And it's a great way of framing it. Yeah, so obviously I'm a sociologist, right? So I assign the most importance to the impact of the social environment, how people are raised with their social relationships, right? That's what I study. That's what I look at. And, my approach is that that's probably the most important, right? Religion is not removed from the social. It's very much impacted and shaped by what's going on around you, right? Like how you're living in, social interactions you have and the environment and context you live in, both culturally, historically, like where you are in a certain certain place in a certain time. And so again, a lot of what I've been talking about are overall trends, but if you live in a different context, like say if you're in a specific community in Canada where religion is a lot more prevalent, then it's a bit different, right? It changes the nature of your experience. And so, yeah, that's, and I've been talking about, what the current environment looks like and how it's impacting religion and spirituality. But the reality is that, we experience social change. It might not happen tomorrow, right? Tomorrow always has a better chance of being like today than being different. But eventually, social change does happen. It might not happen for 100 years. It might not happen for 500 years. It might happen in 5 days. No one can predict the future, and I'm not trying to do that here. It always goes horribly wrong when anyone tries. But social change does happen. And in the last chapter of the book, I'm kind of looking forward, be like, well, where could we see something so fundamental that it would shift the basic structure of our society to change some of the core values that we currently have? Because I'm of the opinion, and I kind of argue this in the book and in my other research, is that in the current social environment, we will still have religious people, but they probably won't encompass a majority of society because there's so much other choice, so many other things going on, and the main key value is individual choice, that they can choose what they want to. We're probably going to be moving forward, at least in the current social context, for a little while, is a context where there is a large non-religious population who's into other things, right? Now, what are some of the conditions that could fundamentally change that, right? Kind of really structurally change the economy, structurally change the values that we have. And so looking forward, I kind of see it as one potential avenue for that, or a source of that would be, the environmental crisis that we're living through now, but is probably going to get a lot worse before it gets better. I'm sitting here in Waterloo, Ontario. I've got my skis in the cupboard and there's no snow in the middle of January, right? Which is almost unheard of. And so we're going through these big climate change and environmental changes, and not just climate change itself, but we're using a lot of resources that are not infinite, they're finite. Eventually we're going to run out. And so moving forward, could that be one source that's going to basically have to force us to change the way we live, right? And I think a lot of people see that coming. Now, what that change looks like, I don't have the answers there, but it will probably be a move away from our consumer market economy, because at some point that's unsustainable, right? Like we in the West consume so much, we have such a big footprint in a way. And, because we live in our society, it's hard to think of how differently we could live, but, people in the past have lived differently and people in the future will live differently. And so there will be social change, and how that impacts religion and spirituality, we'll have to, again, I don't have any answers, but it probably will have an effect on religion and spirituality in both ways. It could mean kind of a return of some forms of religion and spirituality amongst a larger group of the population when they're faced with maybe more difficult conditions moving forward, less material security, a lower quality of life potentially, or it could mean even less religion than we're seeing now, right? If everyone decides to blame a certain form of religion for the environmental crisis, that's not really what's happening now, but you never know, then maybe people will even move even further away from organized forms of religion, right? We'll see. But I guess the kind of key takeaway here is that social change does happen, and the current society we live in isn't going to last forever. And at some point it's going to shift. And I think maybe one of the key areas that's going to force that shift is a kind of entire environment crisis, whether it happens all at once or over a prolonged period of time, we'll see. And that social change will have an impact on how people live their religion and their spirituality, because it always does, right? The environment that we live in always has that impact.
Just before we wrap up, I just had another quick question. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you think is really important for people to understand about your book?
Well, we covered quite a bit, so I think we're pretty good. One key takeaway is I know, there are a lot of stereotypes out there about millennials, maybe less so now because millennials are coming into their own and they're taking over positions of authority and power in society. We see our kind of first millennial politicians, we see our first millennial religious leaders. And so, but there's definitely a lot out there, when I was reading up for the book, there's a lot of negativity out there towards millennials, but also a lot of unattainable expectations, like they're going to save the world or everything's going to be fixed with this generation. They're just real people, right? And this book is about exploring kind of how these people kind of themselves describe how they do religion and spirituality and non-religion in their lives, right? Obviously, there's even more experiences, there could have been more data, and there's always more possibilities, but this is kind of a fun snapshot, hopefully, of some different aspects of that, of how it really happens. And so to kind of not think about extremes of like everyone's non-religious or everyone's religious or everyone's bad or everyone's good, but to kind of see that lived middle ground and kind of diversity that happens. This book is hopefully a small contribution towards that.
Rick, I know you've done a lot of reading and thinking about this concept of the authentic self, and maybe thinking more toward application. I was wondering how you've seen this play out in the context of the church.
Well, I think Sarah does a really good job at describing both the social context and, we talked a little bit about kind of the mechanisms that lead people to sacralize the individual as she talked about it. And I think that this is such an important question for the church because, as Sarah sort of alluded to, that there were certain groups for which the previous era wasn't a good time. And reading people like Charles Taylor, he points to the fact that this idea of the authentic self, that there is a deeper me who is the true me. This sort of goes back to Romantic philosophy. And in Romantic philosophy, the problem that they were trying to address was you have all of these people in authority that are treating us badly. And how do we deal with that? And the answer was to prioritize feeling as a source of truth. And that meant that other external sources of truth weren't truth. And so this is part of how we kind of come to the subjective turn to make what we feel become more important than other things outside. And so in the church, we talk to people about the authority of Scripture, but of course, in a society that emphasizes the authentic self, that's an external authority. And so the narratives that go along with society is that any external authority is really trying to take advantage of you. We hear this in the kind of societal injunctions that, like, you're better than that. And if you think about this, that we're usually calling people to sort of up their behavioral game when we say you're better than that. But what this means is that the true you is better than what we're seeing in your behavior right now. And so your sin, if we can call it sin, is part of somebody else who is behaving like that. And so salvation then becomes the way that you get rid of sin is that you realize that you're better than that. And then that's the real you. And so your sin then really doesn't adhere to you. And so the realization or the connection with your true authentic self is really the mechanism that releases you from sin. And this is different than the gospel that says that we are all sinners in need of salvation from Christ. And as long as we don't recognize that this is really how people are thinking about this, we preach the gospel in such a way that they just hear the gospel as trying to impose an external authority on them. And the way that the narratives are in a society, that's fundamentally exploitative. And so how does this play out in the church? I think we have to realize that this is the thinking that a lot of the people in our culture have, not just millennials. And so we sort of have to address, first of all, how people believe that they're being saved. And the fundamental way that many people in our society believe that they're going to be saved is by connecting with their true self. And once they do that, they're sort of freed from the obligations to the things that they might have done because that wasn't them.
I hear this having massive implications for evangelism and how we're framing what is good news for individuals who've grown up with the idea of the authentic self as being the thing that they are striving toward. Sarah made an offhanded comment after our conversation just saying, I'm glad you didn't ask me how do we convert the non-religious people. And I think that's fair. That's not a question for Sarah, but it is a question for the church.
Yeah, and I think back to the early church and how they heard good news. I've been doing some reading in sort of Roman history. And in Roman history, Caesar, when he went into a town, he would set up inscriptions that would be Caesar's evangel, his good news. And the good news was that Caesar had come in as Savior and Lord and saved the Romans. This would usually be in Roman colonies that were sort of set up by retired Roman soldiers or whatever. And it was a reminder to them. So what we often don't hear in the Gospels is the echoes of this. We call our Gospels, which is the same word that Caesar used for his behavior. And we called Jesus Savior and Lord, which was a direct shot across the bow of the Roman culture and authority. But keep in mind that the early church, the good news was preached into a highly stratified society where you had a few people at the top and everybody who was sort of less than human in the way that they could be used and disposed of by the Roman culture and the people around them. And so when Christians come along and say, it's not just Caesar that will be God. In Caesar, Augustus thought of himself as a god and promoted it and demanded worship from people. But you can become a child of God. And we hear that and we think, well, you're inviting them into your family and that's very nice. We'll give them a hug. But this was really raising up your status from less than human to sharing in Christ's nature. Not that we become a god, but that we share in his nature. And this was really good news for people. And what we have to sort of figure out in our society and the way that we preach the gospel is, what is good news? And how would they hear it? You know, in some cases, you know, every society has a problem that they're trying to solve. Every philosophical system has a problem that they're trying to solve. And for the church, you know, yes, it is the problem of our break in our relationship with God that we're trying to solve. But how do we connect that to the problems that people are facing? And sometimes the methods with which we preach, we're preaching something that worked really well in a particular context of modernity. This is the modern period, and evangelicalism grew up in a modern period. So we need to adapt, and this is a missionary sort of exercise. We need to adapt for the culture here so that people can hear the good news that talks about our relationship with God can be healed and our sins forgiven. There is an urgent need for us to do this. And what I so appreciate about Sarah's book is that she sort of lays this out, at least for millennials, and I think that applies to a lot of our culture as well. She lays this out for us and helps us to understand where our culture is, and this is part of the missiological project that we have to undertake if we're ever to reach our culture again for Christ.
Thanks for listening. Find out more about the EFC's research at www.theefc.ca/research.